Well, I thought I would perhaps start with a quick story. So last year, my company Sparkbox spent, I would say, almost the majority of the entire year consulting with a large financial services company. They're a really competitive company. They have lots of ideas about new products and just ways to kind of like evolve what they're offering their existing customers. But they were really struggling to move as quickly as they wanted on some of their new ideas. So they reached out to Sparkbox. They hired us to build a new product, take one of those ideas they had, turn it into a functioning sort of MVP product. And while we were doing that, they asked if we could also help them to build a first version of their design system. And I think their hope was that we could use the design system that we built in that engagement to help them increase the efficiency of their internal teams so that in the future they could roll out all these additional products that they had in mind. So, of course, it sounded like a great project. We were really excited. We jumped right in. And the way we work is we kind of work alongside an organization's internal team. So we got to know their people, kind of came in and really just started to put our heads down and get this work going. Now, this is the point in a conference talk where usually the speaker says, "Let me tell you about all the amazing lessons I learned in this wildly successful engagement." Unfortunately, that's not the story today. I wish I could tell you that, but I actually want to be really honest with you and tell you that this engagement was a real struggle for us. It was, in fact, so difficult that at the end of that year of work, we made a really tough decision to walk away from the customer. And the reason that we did so, the reason that we gave to them was cultural incompatibility. Now, in 14 years of running a consultancy, this has never happened to me. The experience left me kind of just a little bit shaken, I was just wondering, how the heck did I get here? And most importantly, I was trying to figure out, how do we prevent something like this from happening again? So it was just sort of sitting with me over the holiday break last year. And at the beginning of this year, I started down a rabbit hole of research around organizational culture. And I was trying to set up conversations and talking to just anybody who would give me a few minutes that I thought might have some wisdom for me. So I talked with a lot of people. And the research sort of led me down this path of discovering two frameworks that I want to share with you today that I think will help you probably assess past failures. And my hope is, of course, that it will help you prevent future failures. Before I jump into all of those things, I'll just tell you that I would love to connect with you. I'm out in a lot of different places, Twitter, Ben Callahan, you can DM me there or mention there, and I'm happy to have a conversation. I'm also Ben Callahan on LinkedIn. I made a little form for you, just this link that says connect with Ben. You can give me some feedback on the presentation. You can ask questions there. You can just say hello. I mean it when I say that my favorite part of my job is just getting a chance to talk with people like yourselves, smart people who are trying to solve the same problems that I am. So please do connect. And I also just want to call out that none of the work that I share with you today would be possible without the brilliant and very kind people that I get to work with each day. And you can see all of their smiling faces at sparkbox.com. So I have these two frameworks that I want to share. The first one was developed by a guy named Edgar Sheen. Edgar Sheen is a social scientist and a university professor here in the US, and he's offering a really simple model that we can use just simply to talk about organizational culture. And he said that culture is made up of three layers. The first is our basic underlying assumptions. The second are espoused beliefs. And the third is the artifacts of the culture. Now, let me explain what he meant by each of these. So when he said artifacts, he meant that these are the things that you see when you look around inside of an organization. So the visible perks, the benefits that they offer, healthcare, things like that, the foosball table, the free lunch, all the stuff that you can observe from inside or even from outside of a culture. And when he said espoused beliefs, he meant that these are the things that people say. So a company mission statement, their vision, their values, perhaps the slogan that's printed on the wall in large type. maybe even something like an email signature, and of course, in the conversations that you would have with folks on Slack or Teams or whatever communication tools they use. And then by basic underlying assumptions, he meant this is what people actually believe. Now, of course, these are harder to identify. Most of the time, these kind of come up, they're revealed, I would say, by the actions that people take when they're facing something very difficult. So it's harder to identify what people actually believe. Now, as an employee of an organization, you experience these things from the top down. So on your first day at a new job, you're going to sort of sit back and observe, right? You'll see what's happening around you. You're going to see the artifacts of the culture. And eventually, you'll get to know some folks, you'll have some conversations with them, and you'll get to hear what they say about the culture. And then at some point, your leaders or your peers are going to be faced with a really difficult situation. And that's when you'll learn what they truly believe based on the decisions they make in that tough time. Now, when these three items don't align, when there's misalignment between them, we call that a weak culture. So I just mean that if they're saying one thing, perhaps your leadership is saying one thing, but maybe the decisions they make in a difficult time don't align with the things they say. That means there's a misalignment. That's a weak culture. And oftentimes, weak cultures will have an excessive number of policies and procedures, right? They're trying to find a way to control the behavior of individuals, and they make those decisions many times based on the lowest common denominator of behavior. But when these three tiers align, we call it a strong culture. And that means the organization doesn't need to be as explicit in stating the behaviors they expect. It's really because the people involved in the organization, they want the same things. They share some common values. That alignment helps tremendously in building an organization where people actually trust each other and where people feel like they belong. Now, I know I haven't said a word about design systems yet, but I think it's really important that we've taken a few moments to give all of us a shared understanding and language around culture, because it can be a difficult thing to discuss. So my hope is with this little bit of information, we can now have a real conversation around culture and apply that to the work that we do on design systems. So that was the first framework. The second framework I want to share with you was developed by Kim Cameron and Robert Quinn in the late 90s, and it's called the Competing Values Framework. Now, in this framework, there's 4 primary types of organizational culture that these researchers have identified. And they called it the Competing Values Framework because the X and Y axis are 2 spectrums of competing values. So along the Y axis, they span from flexible to focused. Flexible simply meaning that an organization is dynamic and adaptive. These are cultures that have a willingness to change as that's needed. And focused meaning an organization that's stable or ordered. So these cultures have maybe a stronger confidence to stay true to their founding ideals. Now, the X-axis here spans from an internal orientation to an external orientation. And when they say internal orientation, they mean that this organization makes decisions that are based on factors that originate inside the company. So perhaps the concerns of their employees would be something they really pay attention to. And an external orientation means they make decisions based on factors outside the company. So perhaps things like the economy or maybe their competition. Now, almost every organization is going to have some amount of each of these characteristics. So it's not that you're only one of these quadrants, but this does give us a really nice lens through which to view culture. So let's take a quick look at each of these. In the top left, we're joining flexibility with an internal orientation. This is a collaborative or clan culture. And here there's an eye toward long-term development, cohesion, morale, mutual support. And the common phrase here is that they want to do things together. So oftentimes this is where like a service company would live. In the bottom left, we're joining focus with an internal orientation. And this is a control or a hierarchy culture. And that's where progress tends to be incremental. There's a lot of respect for hierarchy, and there's a lot of value placed on things like stability or predictability. And you'll hear them talk about doing things right. This is where, banking or healthcare or even just organizations that have, sort of a higher amount of risk concern live. Now, I want to pause here because when I put words like collaborate and control on a screen, I think many of you might look at that and say, oh, collaborate, that's really good, and control, that's really bad. But I want to caution you from thinking that any of these options are good or bad inherently. So what I mean by that is that these are really just words that we're using to help understand the tendencies and characteristics of a culture. So collaborative is not necessarily good. Control is not necessarily good. They're all just different. They can be good or they can be bad. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that can look like in the future. All right. So top right, we're joining flexibility with an external orientation. This is a creative or adhocracy culture. Now, I had to look up what adhocracy means. Turns out it just means the opposite of bureaucracy. So basically anything kind of goes in this culture. This is where new ideas break through often. There's a lot of flexibility, creativity. They're thinking about disrupting a market, that sort of thing. They reward entrepreneurship. And there's a lot of value here placed on doing things first. So your startup or your scale-up organization oftentimes kind of begins in this top right quadrant. And then finally, in the bottom right, we're joining focus with an external orientation. And this is a competitive, or they call it a market culture. So there's an eye here towards short-term performance. Acquisition, so buying other organizations, is a major strategy for growth. And individuals here are rewarded for doing things fast. So these are the companies that, are buying their competition as a way to beat them. Now, in my research, along with reading about these kinds of frameworks, I've also just had lots of conversations with folks doing design system work, and I've asked them a lot of questions to try and figure out where they fit in these quadrants. And the kinds of things that I've heard from those folks are in that top left, collaborate. They're always talking about the people, right? So people first is something they always say. In the bottom left, controlling, I hear them talk a lot about risk. They're always trying to figure out how do they, hedge their bets a little bit. How do they avoid that risk? In the top right, up in the creative adhocracy culture, they're just always talking about like shaking things up. They want to disrupt everything. And in that bottom right, competitive, that's where they're always just focused so much on their competition, and what every decision almost is just based on what their competition does and how they can use that information to beat them. So one thing that's interesting here is I've got lots of information on how to assess your organization, and I'll happily share some of those links after this presentation. But usually when I talk to folks, they can look at these four and just after a moment or two of thinking, they kind of quickly recognize where their organization's culture as a whole, the whole organization kind of sits. So I just want to give you a moment. And if you're in the chat, I would love for you to throw in there where you feel your organization fits. Just, again, most organizations are going to have some of these, but if you had to choose one that kind of primarily represented your company as a whole, and maybe a better way to think of it is if I had your CEO or your president or your leadership right here with me on screen, and I asked them what the culture of the company is, what would they say? So that's one way to think about it. So go ahead and throw those answers out there. Now, I also want to call out that culture is formed any place where a consistent group of people interact regularly. So of course that could be the organization as a whole, but it can also mean that a product team or a feature team has its own subculture, or perhaps a group of folks who get on a Zoom call over lunch just to discuss a book. If they're doing that every week or every month, they're going to form their own little subculture. And that means if you have a design system, then there's going to be a subculture that forms around that program. And this is where things, I think, start to get really interesting. So in all of those conversations that I've had with folks, they'll talk to me about the culture of their organization, and they'll identify on this chart where that organization's culture fits. But when I ask them about the culture of their design system program, I think I've only had one team that did not fall on the left side. So almost every single design system culture that I've identified so far exists on the left side of this document, of this quadrants. And that's because that's an internal orientation. And many times design systems are intended to be an internal tool. So that means most design system subcultures are either collaborative or controlling. And remember, neither of those is good or bad, okay? So the first type of common design system subculture is in that top left quadrant. So that's the collaborative area where they value doing things together. Again, they're focused on the long-term success, but I hear them say things kind of like this. I believe the scope of my work, so the design system work, cannot be accomplished in any way other than to partner with teams who have caught the vision. So that's a common sort of sentiment that I hear from teams that are operating their design system program in a really collaborative way. That cross-team collaboration that they aspire to really means the systems they build are enabling instead of restrictive. And then the other primary type of design system culture is found in that lower left quadrant, so the controlling or hierarchy. So we know they value doing things right. They're sort of the incremental improvement over time. They're oftentimes driven by inconsistency in the products. And I hear them say things kind of like this. My product teams haven't created consistency, so I'm here to make sure that they do so. Now, neither of these is right or wrong, but there are healthy and unhealthy versions of each. I think what's important is to take away here is that there's a spectrum between these two cultural types. And we can use that spectrum to kind of help identify the healthy and the unhealthy behaviors. And it's really the extreme ends of the spectrum, which is where those unhealthy behaviors exist. So what I'd like to do quickly is just walk through a few characteristics of design system subcultures and show you kind of how they fit onto this spectrum. So if we were to start by looking at the idea of prioritization, so how do we prioritize work? How do we figure out what's next to work on in our system? Well, a healthy collaborative culture will often do this primarily based on the needs of their subscribers. So they're collaborative. So they're going to sit down. They're going to get to know all the different subscriber groups. They're going to understand the needs they have, and then they're going to use that information, that engaging with those subscribers, with the product teams or feature teams, to make really good informed decisions about what would best serve those subscribers. And a healthy controlling subculture is going to primarily base the prioritization based on the needs of the organization. So it's a slightly different, a different set of exercises, right? It's understanding where is the organization trying to go and how do we build something that will enable our product teams to get there. So what's interesting is that oftentimes I don't see a tremendous difference in the things that they choose to prioritize. It's just the way they go about finding those, discovering those. Now, as you can see, it's the extreme ends. So these are both healthy behaviors. Neither of these is wrong. But if we take it too far on the collaborative culture, there's an unhealthy situation, right? And that's where we try to prioritize every subscriber's needs. And that's, of course, impossible. And what that means is that we end up serving nobody well because we're trying to serve everybody perfectly. And the same is true on that extreme end for control, right? So this is where we tend to ignore input from subscribers. We get zero engagement with our features or product teams. And what ends up happening is we serve nobody well because we're not getting any input. So you can kind of see how this spectrum works, right? There's a healthy set of operations that you can use that are within sort of a reasonable amount of spectrum. But then as we push beyond that into the extreme ends, we kind of find some behaviors that are unhealthy. So let's take a look at another characteristic, adoption, something that I hear folks talking about all the time. How do I get teams to actually use the system that I've built for them or that we put together for them? So a healthy collaborative team drives their adoption oftentimes primarily by relationship. And what I mean by that is they get to know those teams. They spend time with them. They literally build relationships with them. And in that way, they're able to kind of help them become subscribers. They help them adopt. And a healthy version of an adoption process on the controlling side, many times it's primarily driven by incentive. So these are organizations where the design system team is maybe connecting with the bosses of, right, the bosses of the teams they want to be subscribers. They're finding out, what metrics do we have in place to measure success? Are we looking at, like, do we have some KPIs, or how do we reward teams for doing well? And they're working with those bosses, the people in charge, to sort of like add in a few incentives. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily look like that, though. I had some really interesting conversations about with subcultures that were in this controlling side, but operating in very interesting ways. One quick story I can tell you is, I was chatting with the design system lead, and he was really struggling to get the engineers in particular to use the system. And so he said, you know what, I just decided I was going to just try to hang around them and hear the things that were important to them. So he went to lunch a couple times with a few of the developers and he heard them. He said, I heard them talking over lunch almost every time about wanting, how they really wanted to do open source development work. So he kind of just got this idea. He went back to his boss and said, hey, would it be possible for us just to open source our design system? And his boss thought about it. There wasn't anything in there that was proprietary. And they said, yeah, go for it. Maybe if you feel that'll help. So he open sources the system about a month later. And then literally within 2 weeks, he told me he had a bunch of engineers knocking on his door, reaching out, wanting to participate, not just to use the system, but to help him with it. And I just thought that was such a brilliant use of incentive, right? He sat down and learned enough about what those engineers really wanted to be doing. And then he offered that to them in the form of working on the system. So I thought that was a really cool example. Now, again, we can take adoption too far. So on the unhealthy collaborative side, we can get into a situation where it's an unsustainable over support through the adoption process. So what I mean by that is that these are folks who are literally doing the adoption for those teams, right? It's not sustainable. And I think it's really important to recognize that every time you interact with a subscriber team, you are training them on the expectations for what those interactions should look like in the future. So if you're literally holding their hand, doing things for them early on when they're first getting started, you're setting the expectation for what it's going to be like to work with you in the future. So it's not sustainable for you to do everything for them. So there has to be a balance there, right? And on the unhealthy controlling side, it's an unsustainable non-support. So there just is no support, right? They maybe write a few docs and then they just say, go figure it out. And that's going to be frustrating for anybody, of course. All right. So moving on from adoption, we can look at the concept of extension. And when I say extension, I just mean the idea that obviously your design system is never going to serve every possible need perfectly. So, there's sort of healthy ways that a collaborative or a controlling subculture will address that concern. So if we look at the healthy collaborative culture, this is what I would call intentionally flexible. So they're encouraging the subscribers to extend the system when it's needed. So in other words, if the system doesn't meet all of your needs, let's try to make sure that it doesn't. And then if in those situations where you do need something unique or something special, there's a process. We've thought through how to extend the system, and there's a way to do that. And that is part of what it means to use the system. On the control side for healthy, we have this idea of necessarily restrictive. Remember that a lot of times in that controlling subculture, these are teams that are coming together because there is a lot of inconsistency in the product. So they kind of come to it with the expectation that, hey, we have to rein that in a little bit. And so here, the extension of the system is discouraged. It's not that it's not permitted. It's just, we really are going to try to push you toward using what we have before we entertain the idea of extending or changing the system in some way. And of course, you can probably imagine what the extreme ends of this are. So an unhealthy collaborative subculture, there's extreme flexibility. And in other words, there's almost like an overuse of extension. They're not, this gets wild and it gets out of control very quickly, right? And then the opposite is true, where it's an extreme restriction on the unhealthy control. And that's where they basically just say it's forbidden. You're not allowed to extend. You can only use what we've given you. So that's the concept of extension. The last characteristic we'll take a quick look at is this idea of change management. And what I mean is, like, who do we expect? Because design systems will sort of force some change in the process, right? So where do we expect that change to live? Who owns the change? In a collaborative subculture, a lot of times the system is adapting to the workflows of the subscribers. So we're going out, we're engaging with subscribers, we're learning the kinds of workflows they have, and we're trying to meet them where they are. And then the controlling subculture, the subscribers are primarily asked to adapt to the approach of the system. So this is where, again, it's a little bit more central. It's kind of like, we're going to describe for you the new way of working that you will then have to adhere to. Now, the extreme ends of this, on the unhealthy collaboration, it's where that's extreme accommodation. So, in this case, oftentimes these folks are struggling, and they can't make a decision, right? They're working with so many different teams to try and understand all these workflows. It's nearly impossible to come up with, to serve all of those perfectly, right? And on the unhealthy control, it's similar, right? It's just a lack of accommodation for subscriber workflows. So a lot of times here, they're not taking any of those needs into consideration. They build a thing. Many times it simply won't work for a specific product or feature team, and that requires them to then rework the system approach. So all of this is to say, you could probably take any characteristic, right, and put that in where I have change management here, and you could think through what's a reasonable amount of sort of healthy spectrum here between collaborative and controlling, and what happens if I push it too far out onto those edges. Now, I don't expect you to necessarily read this, but I thought you might want to take a quick screenshot if this is information that you find valuable. So you can do that here and have this for later, maybe to take back. It's all of those 4 that we just walked through on one screen. So I'll give you a moment to do that if you'd like. Okay. So the competing values framework here kind of gives us an overview of the types of organizational cultures that you can expect to see. And we've talked, of course, about the idea that your organization as a whole probably has a strength in one of these, and also that subcultures inside of your organization are going to identify with one of these probably more than the other. But probably the most interesting part about this whole thing to me is that not every one of these cultures is compatible with the others. And the way that works is that cultures that are diagonal from each other are kind of like oil and water. They don't work well together. So as an example, if your organization has a really creative, entrepreneurial, do things first kind of culture, if that's sort of your organization as a whole, then it's going to be really hard for you as a design system professional to succeed as a controlling, do things right design system culture. In fact, I was, one story for you, I was doing an interview with a woman who leads a design system for a very large web-based product. And she told me this story. She said, when I began here, the company was kind of in startup mode. So what she was telling me is they were in that top right kind of creative adhocracy, do things first culture. And she said they recognized that their product interfaces were really inconsistent. So they thought, we need to build a design system that will get those inconsistencies under control. So the system they built was intentionally limiting. They were building something that kind of was operating in that bottom left quadrant. They really believed that if they just gave a system to their product teams, it would kind of force them to use the same components, and that would result in little or no extension, and they would have consistency in the product. Well, it turns out that that startup mindset, right? So the whole reason they were in the top right quadrant culture as a whole is that their organization was still trying to find their footing, trying to find the market fit. And so the pivots that their products were making, that leadership was asking for, were really the reason for the inconsistency in the interfaces. And when they offered a design system to those product teams that was limiting, that was controlling, it did not give them the flexibility they needed. So they were still being asked by leadership to respond to these wild pivots and changes in the market, but they just didn't have the tools to do it with the system. So they basically just started operating outside of the system and doing the things they needed to do anyway. Here's what she told me at the very end of that interview, just a quote from her. She said, "We should have recognized the need for flexibility in the system as a way of supporting the necessary pivots the company was taking to find our place in the market. That would have built trust with our subscribers as an enabling tool instead of a restrictive one." And what she was describing to me, without really kind of having this framework yet, is that they should have been more intentional in creating a really collaborative design system culture in that context. That would have allowed them to better serve those pivots and the necessary changes the organization was going through. Now, the opposite diagonal is incompatible as well. So if your company is in a really competitive, sort of do things fast kind of culture, it's actually really hard for your design system program to succeed if you're trying to do that as a really collaborative, do things together kind of culture. In fact, if you'll recall that story that I shared with you at the very beginning of this presentation, I actually believe this is what we were trying to do. See, our client was in a really competitive industry. And because I personally identify in that top left quadrant, I've built my company culture to live there. We're really collaborative. And we were trying really hard to do Sparkbox. We were trying to be what we are best at being, very collaborative. But we were trying to operate against the current of their culture. So my takeaway from that, when I look at this now, is that we need to do a better job of understanding the cultures that we're working in. And perhaps I wonder if we had operated in a slightly more controlling method for that systematic culture we were trying to put in place, maybe we could have been a little bit more successful with them. And when we do this kind of thing, it's going to make us feel like we're swimming with the current instead of against it. So the big takeaway is to look up from the work a little bit, right? To look around, to understand that these forces are definitely at play inside of your company. You can try to fight against that idea, but it's really hard. It's really exhausting. And oftentimes it just doesn't work. So do the work to try and understand the cultures and the subcultures in your organization, and be intentional about forming your own subculture in a way that gives it an actual chance at success. Now, every time I have talked about this with anybody, they ask me this: can the design system subculture change the culture of the organization? So can we kind of push that culture up and out into the organization as a whole? Now, believe me, I want this to be the case. And I've seen really healthy design system subcultures make an impact on the design or the product subculture. But it's really hard and it's very slow work. And honestly, this is organizational level change that we're trying to put into place. So that's tough to do. But it really comes back to this diagram. You'll remember that I said we experience this from the top down. So we start with artifacts. That's the first thing we see. Then we experience what people say. And then eventually we may learn what people really believe. But you create culture from the bottom up. So you can't create from the top down, right? Maybe you've been at a company where they were having cultural challenges, so they bought a ping pong table, right? Not going to help, right? Instead, what you need to do is identify the underlying assumptions that people have and look for the overlap, look for the places where we have common values. And when you do that and you sort of center in on those things, you'll find that these other two layers become a natural outpouring of those beliefs. And with that cultural alignment, the things that we say and the things that we see are simply a reflection of the things that we believe. And I want to close this talk with just one kind of simple idea. Your design system is not going to make your products more consistent. So just think about this. I promise you, I could take any one of your design systems and make something completely terrible with it. And I bet you could do that with any design system that Sparkbox has built. What's hard about this, like the real hard truth here, is that people will make what they want to make. And the critical word in this statement is the word want. So if consistency or cohesion is your goal, then your only sustainable way to get that change is to change what your subscribers want to do. And you do that with culture. You don't do that with pixels. You don't do that with code or documentation, not with Figma, not with React. And your design system can be a catalyst for this kind of change, but it is not going to do it on its own. That is the unspoken and deeply challenging mandate of a design system team. This is your job. I hope that some of the ideas I've shared with you today will help you to do that job a little bit better tomorrow. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. Well, what a pleasure it was. I think that many things that you mentioned around just finding the right quadrant for your organization will have resonated a lot with people who with attendees in the chat. So that was really interesting to see. Maybe one thing that I would like to ask you before we jump in a panel with everyone.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like it's kind of getting very, very difficult at times to understand what the company is actually like, what the culture is actually like. It seems like sometimes you're getting mixed signals. You know, if you ask a company, so do you feel like how would you identify yourself? Very often you would hear things like we're agile and collaborative and all those things, but in reality, it doesn't feel like they are, or it doesn't feel like most, at least, teams in the company do. And sometimes you also get the situation where, let's say, there is some, how would I put it best, there is some group of people who are working very much, collaboratively and try their best, and they work very, very hard to make sure that it kind of works within a very different environment. It's kind of almost like a subculture, right?
Yes.
So how would you then decide what to do if you have, let's say, this mixed cultures cooperating almost within the same environment, if it makes sense?
I'll tell you that every organization has that. Every single company has many cultures happening, right? And that's kind of the whole point here is I think a lot of times we talk about culture as if it's just, what's the culture of your company? It's that simple, but it's definitely not. And I've even simplified it here, because if you think about the job of a design system program or a team, they have to interact with every product team. So each of those product teams has their own subculture. Now, hopefully in an organization where their values are a true reflection of the things that people believe, there's going to be a lot more alignment in those subcultures. But oftentimes it's not that way. And so, as a team, what I'm suggesting here, I think, is that you look at everything that you offer on that spectrum, and you try to imagine. So if you take an example of like a contribution model, well, there's a very collaborative way to do contribution, right? We can, when something doesn't fully meet the needs of a product team, we could sit with them and help them evolve that in a way, like extend a component or whatever they're doing in a way, and then work with them to refactor that in a way that it works for other teams and now integrate it back into the system. That's a really collaborative approach to contribution. But there's also a healthy model of contribution that isn't like that. That's a little bit more controlling. It's a little bit more, linear. And in that model, you might say, hey, here's the steps that we go through, right? Here's a process to extend if you really need to do that. And then once you've done that, here's what you have to do with that extension to get it to a place where then we will take it from there. Maybe there's a little bit of work on our part as a systems team to refactor it and get it in, but it's not us working together, right? It's more of a, here's what you do, follow these steps, and we'll integrate. And those are both valid approaches to contribution, but one is a little bit more on the controlling side, one's a little bit more on the collaborative side. And I think depending on the needs of those subcultures, you might offer one or the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I mean,